Okay, one last audio check. Just type in the chat box if you can hear me okay, and then we are going to start. Just want to make sure that the video is clear, the audio is clear. We are live at noon Chicago time, 1 o'clock East Coast, 10 o'clock West Coast, and trying out some new webinar software. So I just want to make sure the audio is good. It sounds like everyone can hear, so let's get started. It's great to see everybody. Great to have you here for the book launch party. I've never done one of these before, but it's a live online book launch party. I got some bubbly that you can see. So we're kind of celebrating. Toast to you. And I think we're going to have a great call. Over the next 55 minutes, we'll do a couple of surprises, a couple of giveaways. If you haven't got your hands on Recruit Rockstars, I might be able to put one in your hands as we go, if you answer some questions correctly. But first, let me just give you a sense of little housekeeping. If you could turn off your phone, turn off your Facebook, turn off your Twitter. It's all going to be there, I promise, when we finish at the top of the hour. And I will make sure, as I mentioned in my note, that we will be done within 55 minutes. I'd like to ask people to just tune this out. You might also want to grab just one piece of paper, because I'm going to give you a couple of things that you might want to think about, maybe even over the weekend as you head into your 2018 recruiting plans. And so you might just want to jot down a couple things. So I'll give you a second to grab that as well. But like I said, we are live. And I do these once a month. This is the first time we've done a book launch party. Hopefully by the end, the wine will be getting to me, but I'll still be able to, despite the champagne, still be able to share some thoughts with you. So for those of you that don't know, I'm Jeff Hyman, and I lead an executive search practice called Strong Suit Executive Search based in Chicago. We work nationally with a lot of growth companies. I've been in this field now for 25 years, thus explaining the gray hair and the lack of hair that you see. And so over the next 55 minutes, I want to walk you through some of the key lessons that I incorporated into the book. This is the same content that I teach at the Kellogg Business School in Chicago. I teach a course on recruiting there to some amazing students, and they really seem to enjoy it and get a lot out of it. I hope you will as well. And I'm just going to power up the deck here. So if you can just stick with me momentarily, we will have that. Like I said, we're trying some new webinar software. And we are going to switch over now and go through a couple of slides. Here we go. If you could type in the chat box, if you can see that, that would be great. Just type in the chat box that you can see those slides clearly, and we'll get started. So I'm really super excited. The book was really well received. In fact, it was named a bestseller by Amazon in the first 3 hours of launch. So we did a little bit of pre-marketing just to let people know that the book was going to be coming out, and the reception, like I said, has just been great. So with that said, let's get to it. And here we go. So I want to make sure you can still see that. This is the book, and this is the individual that you were trying to avoid. Bad hires, right? I am on a mission to help companies eliminate or dramatically reduce bad hires. And there's a whole bunch of reasons that bad hires happen. I'm sure you'll be able to identify with some of these, but you know what I'm talking about when I talk about a bad hire. This is the individual that, within a week or a month of hiring them, you realize that you have made a very significant mistake. And what that leads to, of course, is micromanaging, babysitting, taking a very directive approach. I'm sure you guys can identify with this. I've hired over 3,000 people over the past 25 years, both for the 4 companies I've started as well as for clients. And I can tell you that every time you make a mishire, you ask yourself, what was I thinking? You ask yourself, what was I thinking? And it inevitably leads to this departure, and you want to do your very best to avoid that. But now imagine a different scenario, a scenario where you can live a life that has some work-life balance because you trust your team. You can actually set the iPhone aside on the weekends. You can beat your numbers instead of missing them by 5, 10, 20%. You ship your products on time. You have a board of directors and investors that are actually excited and happy with your performance. And all those things are possible, but I've come to the conclusion that unless you build a team of rock stars in every seat at every level in your company, you're not going to do it. That's what it takes. In fact, you've heard the old expression that I'd rather invest in an A team with a B product or a B idea than a B team with a great product. And that is so true, not just for investors, but for yourself. So over the next few minutes, like I said, we're going to talk about, kind of go through some of the big mistakes that people make, and I'll give you, frankly, some of the resolutions that I've learned that help to avoid those mistakes. Real quickly, background, like I said, I've started a bunch of companies, raised a bunch of money. I teach this stuff at Kellogg Business School in Chicago, and have just been fascinated by recruiting for as long as I can remember. Really coming out of school, I just found it fascinating, the concept of a company looking for talent, finding that talent, and assessing that talent. And over the 25 years of doing this, sadly, I've identified 10 key critical mistakes that people make. And that's kind of what we're going to spend time over the next few minutes. But before we do that, let me take you through a few crucial facts. Fact one is that 50% of new hires fail. So if you stop and think about that, there's probably no other element of business where that ratio would be acceptable, right? In a manufacturing line, imagine 1 out of every 2 products not working, or financial results, 1 out of every 2 financial statement being accurate. It's kind of ludicrous, but that's in fact what most companies do. They have a 50% batting average. They trust recruiting to a coin toss. And I have identified ways that you can increase that 50% accuracy up to 90% accuracy. And that's what I'm going to help you do on this call. 2/3 of growth companies fail due to people problems. Now that includes recruiting, it includes culture, but it's essentially the people part of the business, not the product part of the business, right? It's not product market fit. It's not that we ran out of money. 2/3 of companies fail because they get this people stuff wrong, which is just an incredible statistic. In fact, I've come to conclude that 90% of your business problems are actually recruiting problems in disguise. And I want to know if you agree with me. So type in the chat box if that statistic sounds about right to you, that 90% of your problems are actually recruiting problems in disguise. Just type in the chat box if you agree or disagree. And I'll grab some champagne while you do that. Right. So most people agree, right? So 90%. Imagine if you could get the people part of your business right, how much easier it would be to ship your products on time, to hit your numbers. And especially in a service business, a customer service business, it is the people. That is everything. The whole thing is people. It has never been harder to recruit rock stars. That's why I wrote this book. You know, my publisher begged me to hold this book and publish it next year, because November, December are a notoriously difficult time to launch a book. And those of you that may know me know I'm pretty stubborn. And I said, absolutely not. It has never been harder. We're at a 4.1% unemployment rate, 4.1. The unemployment rate for college-educated knowledge workers is 2%. So we're basically at full employment. It hasn't been this hard in decades, and I didn't want to wait to get this out, because as you start to think about 2018, you got to start to think about how are you going to get rock stars in the door when it's never been this difficult. Finally, fact 5, something to think about. If you have a desire to become the best business performer you can, maybe you want to be a first-time CEO, or you want to grow your business, or you want to personally be hunted by headhunters. There's 90,000 headhunters and they would love to call you. You must learn this stuff. Recruiting Rockstars is what enables you to become a business rock star. You can be successful in any industry, in any company size, if you learn how to surround yourself with a great team. That's ultimately what it's all about. And when I say a great team and the word rock star, let me be really specific, because a lot of people use a lot of different terminology. When I'm saying rock star, I'm not referring to the high ego individual. What I'm talking about is a shortcut for the top 5% of people that are available on the market at the compensation level that we can afford for this role. So that to me is a rock star. So if I were to look at 1,000 candidates that are out there, there's 50 that are rock stars. They are the top 5% that I can afford. If I can't afford them, doesn't really matter. They're not included in the consideration set. And so with that said, as we start to think about recruiting rock stars, what I'd like to take you through now is what most hiring managers do, and then what you need to do to increase that hiring accuracy from 50% up to 90%. Now, no one is ever going to be at 100%, just not possible. But I've consistently seen companies that refine and improve their process and use a process where maybe they didn't before, get to about a 90% hit rate. So let's go through this. But I just want to make sure you're with me. So just type in the chat box an answer to this question. And whoever's the first one to type the answer, I'm going to send you a free copy of the book. I promise we're going to give some of these away. What is the current unemployment rate in the U.S.? What is the unemployment rate right now in the U.S.? First one that types it, there's a few second lag time here, but first one that types it, I'm going to ship you a copy of the book. And I promise not to autograph it because I am just not that cheesy. There you go, Shannon. Shannon got it right, 4%. It's actually 4.1, but the point is it hasn't been this low in a very long time. So when unemployment, which has a lot of sensitivity to it, is at 8%, 10%, 15%, it's easy, a lot easier to find people. But when it's at this kind of low rate, 4%, it's virtually impossible. So with that said, let's now go through deadly sin number 1. The first mistake that companies make, or hiring managers make, is to start interviewing and say, once I find it, I'll figure it out and then I'll hire that person. So it's a I know it when I see it kind of approach to recruiting. Now, while that doesn't sound like a big mistake, it's a huge issue because it wastes a ton of time. In addition, because you're going to have multiple interviewers, and by the way, the ideal number is 4, as I'll explain in a second, you need to get agreement from those 4 people up front as to what it is we're looking for. Otherwise, you'll waste weeks and months trying to get those 4 people on the same page. Now, why is 4 the right number? Google has done some fantastic studies, long-term longitudinal studies, and they found that 4 is the right number of interviewers. Anything over that, with each additional interviewer, 5, 6, 7, etc., you only get 1% more predictive. So your accuracy only improves a tiny bit. So in the interest of expediency, 4 is the right number. Agreeing up front and creating a scorecard, and I'm happy to send you a sample scorecard. There's one in the book that really maps out exactly what we're looking for. And the scorecard looks a little different than what a lot of companies use because they kind of go about it focused on things that are not predictive of success. So that is deadly sin number 1. And let's go to number 2. Many people focus on things that are not predictive of success. Like I said, they'll get a resume and they'll look at things like what companies that individual worked for. What were their titles? What school did they go to? Many companies used to look at GPA. Again, referencing back to Google, they have stopped looking at GPA because they found it was not predictive of success. By the way, neither is what school someone went to, what field they've worked in, their titles, and a bunch of other things that are not predictive of anything. What you want to focus on instead are things that are highly predictive. And one of the highest predictors that I've found in my career of recruiting is what I've called DNA. DNA, just like our physical DNA that determines our hair color, our eye color, our height, personality DNA determines what we're going to be like as a person. Are we going to be creative? Are we going to be detail-oriented, methodical, kind of OCD? Are we going to be analytical? Those things tend to not change over time. Scientists have found that by age 8, we are largely baked, if you will, as a cake would be. And if you're not going to change, then those DNA elements tend to be pretty predictive. Now, you can't sit down and interview someone and say, so tell me about your DNA. It doesn't work. So in the book, and in a moment, we'll talk about interviewing and how you get at DNA. But the key mistake, the key sin, is to focus on things that are not predictive. Okay? I'm going to pause there and just make sure that you're with me. So just type in the chat box if that makes sense. Just type yes or no. If you have any questions so far, I'd love to make this interactive. But again, the deadly sin number 2 is focusing on things that have no bearing. Now, obviously, if someone has industry experience, that's great. If someone went to a terrific school and has a great education, that's great, right? I'm not dismissing those things. But what you'll find and what scientists have found, because there's now enough body of science on this stuff, that these things are not predictive. If someone went to Harvard, which is an example I use in the book, and I know plenty of amazing Harvard people, it's a good indicator that someone might have a great knowledge base or a great intellect, but it's not necessarily a great predictor that for your particular company and your particular role that they're going to be successful. It's just not enough. So with that said, let's go to deadly sin number 3. It's one of my favorites. And this is the job description. So when you think about recruiting essentially is sales and marketing. You market to bring in a pool of talent, and then you vet them and hopefully close them. And that's the sales process. What many companies do, your company may be one of them, is they don't lure talent in. They don't attract talent like a magnet. Now, part of that is because they don't have much of an environment. Their culture is just damaged, etc. You got to get those things in place. But once you do, and you really do have a compelling story to tell, what good is it to publish a job description that puts candidates to sleep? And I would implore you to read through a bunch of your company's job descriptions, and I'm sure you've applied for jobs in the past, and many of them are written almost like they're written by a lawyer or an HR person, nothing wrong with HR people, but they're not written like a marketing document. At the companies I've started, we actually would hire professional copywriters to write an incredible advertisement, and I call it a job invitation. We're inviting people through the messaging, which now can do through video as well, in such a way that's so compelling that they want to have a confidential discussion with us. Rockstars will do that. B and C players will respond to job descriptions that have bullet point after bullet point after bullet point of you must have this experience, you must have that experience. But Rockstars will not. Rockstars want to know what's in it for them. They need to be sold, even to engage in the discussion. So the shorthand I want you to think about is that where we were is apply here, right? Click to apply. That doesn't work in a 4% unemployment market. Let's talk. Let's have a conversation. P.S. We'll keep it confidential on the down low. Does work. Very subtle distinction. And I'm not referring to the buttons on the website, although that too. I'm referring to the mindset around using compelling and engaging job invitations that are so exciting that people want to engage in a discussion with you. You'll open up your funnel dramatically at the top of your recruiting funnel if you do that one step and stop putting candidates to sleep. Type in the chat box if that makes sense. Before we go into deadly sin number 4, I'm going to have a little bit more bubbly while you do that. I'm fighting a cold, so I'm finding that the champagne actually helps soothe the throat quite a bit. Okay. Let's move on to deadly sin number 4. Oh, I love this one. This is about sourcing. So now we know what we're looking for, right? We've got our DNA identified. We've got a scorecard, so we know how we're going to evaluate candidates. We've written this masterful piece that attracts candidates. How do we get the word out? And where are we sourcing from? The biggest mistake companies make is using online job postings as their primary sourcing method. I have nothing against online job postings. I've started an online job posting company in the past. They serve their place. But in a low unemployment market where most people are currently working, you don't attract the eyeballs that you used to. They're not looking for a job. So by definition, they're probably not reading your job posting. So instead of taking a post and pray strategy where you post a job, you'll get 300 resumes, no question. You'll always get 200, 300. You'll go through them. You may find 1 or 2 people that are even worth having a discussion. That is not the way to fill your pipeline with talented candidates that you want to talk to. The number one way to do it is through networking, and specifically through your employee referral program. That's right. The network of your employees is the single best way to do it. 50%, I'll say it again, 50% of your hires should be coming through your employees' referrals. At most companies, it is 20%. So there's a huge gap, and I'll tell you why in a second, between where it should be and where it is. But half your hires should be coming through your employees' network. The next biggest chunk should be coming through your personal networking. Because if you're going to invest 30 to 50% of your time on recruiting and retention, which is what I tell people they need to spend, 30 to 50% of your time on this stuff, and then people say, well, where am I going to get 30 to 50% of my time? The answer is, when you hire Rockstars, you don't need to micromanage them. You don't need to babysit them. All the stuff we talked about earlier, you now have freed up your time to network and build your pipeline of candidates in advance of when you need it. So versus just-in-time hiring, we're moving to much more of a pipeline mentality. So type in the chat box. I'm just curious if you have an employee referral program. Just type yes or no. You have one, you don't have one. Doesn't matter what size company you are. But type in the chat box if you even have an employee referral program or if you think it's being well used. Okay, most people do on the call, and that's great. If it's not delivering the kind of results that you want, and there's a whole chapter in the book about how to properly set up your employee referral program. So I'll take you, through step by step. Most people make the mistake of thinking, well, I can't afford to pay a lot. Google, again, has done some studies and found when they doubled the payout from $2,000 to $4,000 per hire. This is live video. That is a live dog. Okay. It did not make a single difference. Didn't make any difference in the referrals from their employees. So I don't care if you can afford to pay $100, $1,000. I know some companies that pay $10,000. It's not the amount as much as your marketing of the program, keeping it fresh, getting it in front of them every other week. And there's ways to do that and keep it creative. It is a marketing program. Now, if you're doing that and you're not getting referrals, then you got to ask yourself some other questions. And Glassdoor.com may have the answers because your employees may not be that happy. And if they're not going to refer people to come work there. So you got to drill into it to figure out why the referrals aren't coming. But this should be your number one. This is the holy grail of recruiting. Employee referrals are faster, less expensive, more likely to stay, more likely to do well. It reinforces your culture. And at every company I've built, it was our magic solution to recruiting. Before you rely on job postings and all these other expensive things, including headhunters like me, make sure you're tapping out your personal network and your employees' network. And then finally, mastering advanced search on LinkedIn. 10, 20 years ago, recruiting was super hard because the majority of it was sourcing. How do I even find people? And you would smile and dial all day long to get candidates. Now, 2017, we use LinkedIn, master advanced search, learn how to use it. You'll find people in your town, in your industry that you can connect with through a mutual connection, and you can find out if they're any good. And we'll talk about reference checking in a minute. So let's move on to deadly sin number 5. By the way, before we go to 5, this is what a typical funnel looks like. In my experience, talking to 100 or looking at least 150 people is necessary to virtually assure that you wind up with one Rockstar hire. Let's do the math from the bottom up, actually. To wind up with one hire, we need to wind up with 2 Rockstar finalists. In case our first choice doesn't accept the offer, we always have a backup, always. If you don't have a backup, you got to restart this whole process, and that's where these searches take months and months. To wind up with 2 Rockstars, you need to wind up with 5 people that you vet thoroughly, and I'll take you through that in a minute. So you just kind of work your way up. This is sales and marketing. Recruiting is sales and marketing. 150, and I've confirmed this with a lot of other recruiters, seems to be the magic number. If you start with only 10, 20, 30, 40 people, you may very well not wind up with a Rockstar. If, on the other hand, you feel the need to talk to 1,000 or 2,000 people, there's something wrong in your process as well. So just start to think about those numbers. And again, I'm happy to send you this deck, and there's a chapter in the book that kind of lays all this out, the math, okay? Let's go on to deadly sin number 5. This is where most people fall down, and that is interviewing. So type in the chat box if you have interviewed a candidate in the past 30 days. Just type yes or no. I just want to understand the level of experience and recency. And so type in the chat box if you've interviewed at least one person for a job in the past 30 days. Okay, most people, yes. Few people, no. Right? Pretty good mix. And I find this consistently with my clients. They all say the same thing. I've been interviewing for many years. I know how to do this, and I really trust my gut. Well, let me tell you that science will show you, if you read the studies, and I've read them all, and they're not the most exciting things in the world, so I've summarized them in the book so you don't have to read them. Your gut will mislead you half the time. And let's go through a live example. So you're about to meet with a candidate. They walk into the room. They're dressed super sharp. They look the part. They're out of central casting. This is for a sales position. And she's tall and dynamite and great handshake, and she nails the interview. And you decide in the first 20 seconds, typically, what you think of that person, just based on how she looks and how she talks and walks and all these really non-predictive things. Confirmation bias leads you to spend the rest of the 59 minutes trying to find data to confirm your original hypothesis, which is that she's a winner. You might interview another candidate. He walks in, he's all schlumpy, ties all crooked, wet handshake, kind of mumbly, he's introverted. And in the first 20 seconds, you say, oh, this guy's no good. He can never sell. And you will look for data for the next 59 minutes to confirm your original hypothesis. This is the way our mind works. It's the way we're wired. It's the way we're predisposed. When, in fact, and I go through this in the book, How to Lead an Interview This Way, you look for data to overcome your original hypothesis. You actually try to trick your brain into looking for ways to prove you were wrong. You'll find that a bunch of the time you had a false negative, and this actually is a great candidate for the position. Or you'll find when you dig that the story just falls apart and it was nothing more than a pretty suit, and you've hired those before. So we're looking to be predictive in interviews and not focus on unpredictive dimensions. The other critical issue that people make when interviewing, you may be guilty of this, is using what I call an unstructured process, which basically means asking random questions in a random order to different people that aren't even the same from candidate to candidate. That introduces 2 big issues. Number 1, we're trying to get at, by the end of the interview, a trend line. Is this candidate trending up? Is this a winner that's on a growth trajectory that can help take my business to the next level? Is this candidate plateaued, or is this candidate have they peaked? Are they on a downward trajectory? And you're trying to get the answer to those. Well, how can you do that unless you ask the same structured questions, position after position after position, over their background? And you can begin, just like a stock chart, to plot out how this person is doing. Similarly, how can you possibly compare candidate A with candidate B unless you're asking the same questions to get at the same types of dimensions? When you have a random, unstructured interview process, it's impossible to do that. Type in the chat box if that makes sense. It may sound obvious, but I've sat in hundreds and hundreds of my clients' interviews, and I come away befuddled because they're making up questions on the spot, questions that are not predictive of anything, and then they ask different questions to different candidates. So how can you possibly compare from one to the other? It's impossible. So in the book, and it looks like most of you agree, in the book I kind of lay out the exact questions. I don't even care if you buy the book, I'll email them to you. But I've actually created an interview guide. It's one page, it's super simple, and you're asking the same questions over and over. I will even tell candidates the questions in advance because I don't want them to be nervous. I want them to be their authentic self so I can get at the actual person, not this BS candidate that walks in the door. So you've probably learned the hard way. It looks like some of you have, and you're typing in the chat box. This is probably the biggest sin. This is our ego and our arrogance. I've interviewed hundreds or thousands of people over the years. I know how to do it, and so I don't do it methodically. And you'll make mistakes. You'll lose some phenomenal candidates, and you'll hire some really crappy candidates because a good candidate does not necessarily equal a good employee. Please never forget that. Let's move on to the next sin. Sin number 6. Oh, I love this one. So you interview a great candidate. You call off the search. We have found our head of marketing. She was amazing. And you immediately start talking about start date and preparing an offer. And that's the end of the process. And that could not be further from the ideal. Interviews are not highly predictive. Now, I'm not saying don't interview. You have to interview. And the book takes you through how to do it the right way. But for gosh sakes, don't stop there, because the single most predictive thing you can possibly do is to add this next step after interviewing, and I call it the test drive. Some companies call it a job audition, a dry run, an internship. I've seen it called a million different things. But it is the single most predictive thing that you can do. And it is simply to create a test, not a written, mathematical test, but a test situation that mirrors the actual job the person is going to perform. So if it's a manufacturing assembly line role, you're going to actually have them work for 2 hours and observe how they go about doing what they do. Can they prioritize? Can they keep up with the pace? Do they know what questions to ask? If it's a chief financial officer, you're going to give them last quarter's financials and have them analyze them and write a summary and present it to you. If it's a sales position, you're going to have them read a customer dossier and make a presentation to that customer. Even though they don't know the product inside and out, what you're looking for is their DNA. And you can get at DNA much better in a real world scenario than in a fictitious white room interview. Interviews are notoriously unpredictable. Again, you got to do them the right way, but then look at the most single predictive element, which is the test drive. Only 9% of companies do a test drive. So 91% of companies are missing this step. If you only take away one thing from this webinar, implement the test drive, and you will dramatically increase your hiring accuracy from 50%, maybe to 60 or 70. It's that big a difference. Type in the chat box if your company does a test drive consistently for all finalists before you hire them for all roles. Just type yes or no. I'm just curious if people do this or if this is kind of a new concept to you. So if you do, if you don't, I implore you, again, to think about how to put this in place. And, you got to crawl before you walk, before you run. Figure out what position you're going to hire the most of in 2018 and start with that position. If it's sales reps, if it's software developers, manufacturing, whatever it might be, and create a 2-hour or 2-day test drive. Even if you have to pay the finalist for their time, it doesn't matter. Most candidates won't take the money, but you'll observe that person and you will realize that they did great in the interview, but they totally bombed on the test drive, or vice versa. It has changed my mind time after time with candidates. So that is deadly sin number 6, skipping the test drive. Let's go to the next deadly sin, number 7, which is references. Now, I'm not going to tell you reference checking is fun. Do I enjoy reference checking? Not really, but it's part of my job. I do it every day. And even though I tell my clients, don't let me do your references, you should be doing this yourself, because the hiring manager learns so much from reference checking about how to properly manage and lead and inspire the individual. You should never entrust it to a headhunter like me, to your HR department. Nothing against HR, but the hiring manager should do reference checks herself or himself. Aside from doing the references, the question is, who do you talk to? And most people will they'll ask the candidate for a list of 3 or 4 references, and they'll talk to those references. Now, they ask the wrong questions. They have already made their hiring decision. In fact, I see offer letters all the time that say, we're offering you the job pending reference checks, which basically means unless we find out you're a serial killer in the reference checks, we're hiring you. In which case I would say, why even waste your time? You've already made your decision. References should be used before you make your decision, particularly with 2 finalists. It can be a very powerful tiebreaker to get at validating all the information that you've been told by candidates. Now, does it take some time? Absolutely. Is it fun? Not really. It can take half a day. It can take a whole day. But imagine if you save yourself one bad hire, you will thank the fact that you did those reference checks. And I find in general, reference checking for Rockstars is much easier. People call you back real quickly. They tell you, if you don't hire this person, you're an idiot. So they have this conviction that means you have to read through the lines a lot less. With B and C players, you're playing detective. You must also talk to backdoor references. Backdoor references are people that are not provided to you by the candidate, but you can find them on LinkedIn. Could be vendors, customers, former coworkers. We're not looking to cause an issue for this individual, but it is totally legitimate. It's totally legal and ethical, and I will not hire someone unless I've checked at least as many backdoor references as front door references. And again, the book kind of walks you through how to do that. Or just send me an email and I'll send you a guide to doing it. So that is a big sin. Type in the chat box if you check backdoor references consistently on every hire that you make. Just type yes or no. And I think the champagne is finally starting to kick in, because I feel like it's time to give away another book. So type in the chat box, do you check backdoor references consistently? This is legal. It is ethical. People ask me all the time. You've got to be doing this, because obviously the ones they give you are going to be their best references. I want to talk to the people that are going to give me the facts. Okay, let's go to the next deadly sin, and then we're going to give away a book. You've made your decision. You've checked the references. Now we're going to make an offer. So many Rockstar candidates are lost in the offer process. Why is that? B and C players don't have as many choices. They don't have headhunters calling them. They will take your offer. Rockstars have choices. They get headhunter calls every day. They are very selective. They know exactly what they're looking for, and you need to make it a super easy decision for them in order to close them. So that means a couple of things. The hiring manager should be the one making the offer. Why is that? It's not because I don't trust HR. It's because I want an emotional, personal connection between the hiring manager and that finalist candidate. I want the hiring manager saying, I want you on my team. There's arguably nothing more powerful in this world than knowing that we want to be wanted. Everyone wants to be wanted, wants to be needed. Have a hiring manager telling you, I want you on my team, is incredibly powerful. Makes it an emotional, personal thing versus just a piece of paper, just money. It cannot be about money, because there's always someone down the street that can pay more than you can. So that's number one. Number two, the offer should be a verbal offer. Before we put it in writing, spend a lot of time, go back and forth, negotiating. I want to have a verbal conversation with the finalist candidate, make them the offer. I want to hear from them in their voice. Are they excited? What are their issues? What needs to be negotiated? And that's okay if some things need to be adjusted. Only then do I put it in writing. And once I put it in writing, that candidate has 36 hours to sign it and return it. That's called an exploding offer. I recognize that is controversial to some people, but let me tell you why I do it that way. It's because we've already negotiated everything. There's nothing more left to discuss. And in 36 hours, if that finalist is not pretty convinced that they want to join us, then that's fine. But we're going to move on. And we're going to move on to the backup candidate that I told you that we had. We always have 2 finalists. I want my first choice candidate. I'm very competitive, but I'm not going to risk losing my second choice because the first one is dilly-dallying and taking 5 days or 10 days to get back to me. So I make it very clear when I present a verbal offer, or when one of my clients presents a verbal offer, that once we negotiate this, you're going to get a letter and you're going to have 36 hours to sign it. And if you need a week or 2 weeks, fine. But I'm not wasting the time giving you an offer. Finally, that offer must have no surprises in it. I would say 80% of the time when I see a client send out an offer letter, they've changed the title, they've changed the salary, they've changed the start date, they've changed who the boss is going to be. That is enough to spook any candidate. So make sure there's no surprises from what that candidate has been led to believe throughout the process. Okay, it's time to give away a book. I'm going to give away a book. The question is, what is the single most predictive thing in recruiting? The single most, if you could only rely on one thing, what is it? First one to type the right answer, I'm going to send you a copy of the book. I promise I won't autograph it. I'm not that cheesy, but I will mail it to you immediately. There's a little lag time on this webinar software, so I'm going to give it just a couple seconds. Okay, Cynthia got the right answer. Cynthia said DNA. A lot of you said DNA, desire, a lot of stuff. But Cynthia got it right. Cynthia, I'm going to send you a book. Okay, so let's move on to deadly sin number 9. We're almost through all of them. I'm sure by now you're probably identifying with at least 1 or 2. Number 9 is a big one. And the temptation is to say, I hired a rock star, and I need them so desperately, and I'm going to dump them in the pool. Good luck. On day 1, we're going to have you fill out your forms, show you where the bathroom is, take you to lunch, and by 1 o'clock, you are on board. That is the end of your onboarding process. And I understand that temptation. I've needed to hire people in the past where I needed them yesterday, and I needed productivity out of them immediately. But I can tell you from 25 years of doing this that no matter how urgent that need was, you must lay out a plan for the first 30 days. Even a rock star needs to learn so many things about your business to be even somewhat useful. Now, I would say that most rock stars are 80% ramped within 60 days. So this is not a long process. I don't agree with companies that give people 6 months, a year, 2 years to assess them. In 60 days, they should be 80% ramped. But trying to get them productive by week 1 is a recipe for disaster. In fact, 2% of new hires don't return for their second day of work. 2% of new hires say, this company is a mistake, this was a mistake, I'm done. And they don't come back for day 2. So don't be one of those companies. And I have an onboarding guide I can send you if you want, but think about the things that a new hire needs to learn. They need to learn your products and services, your pricing, your strategy. They need to learn your technology platforms. They need to learn the organization, the culture, what's expected of them, the politics of the place, how decisions are made. They need to learn the competition and customers and distribution channels. I don't care what position or what level they are. Most of them need to learn the same thing. So definitely start people at the same time and teach them as a class, set up a university, even if it's a very basic type of thing. Start them on a certain day each month or every other week. But then there are certain things that each individual needs to learn for their specific role. But you've got to have an onboarding plan. In fact, I will not let one of my staff make an offer until I have seen the onboarding plan, because I want to know that the most expensive thing we're ever going to do, which is hiring a person, no matter how senior or junior, is likely to be successful because I've seen the onboarding plan. Similarly, The other sin people make is waiting too long to identify and take care of mishires. Now, I said early on, we're going to increase your batting average from 50% to 90%, which is huge, but you're still going to be 90%. So you're not going to be perfect, which means 1 out of every 10 hires that you make was a mistake. Just a mistake. They slipped through. They're a mishire. They're not a bad person. It's not necessarily that they're not a cultural fit. Maybe they are a cultural fit, but don't have the competencies to do the job. Maybe they do have the competencies, but they were a big cultural mismatch. Whatever it is, you're going to make a mistake at least 1 out of every 10 times. And I have seen clients, and I've been guilty myself, waiting a month, 2 months, 6 months, 12 months, 2 years before finally taking care of the problem. And there's a whole chapter in the book on how to fire someone. You're not firing them for performance. You're having an honest discussion, which is to say, I made a mistake. I, the hiring manager, I own it. This was not a great move. And how can we problem solve to move you to a company or sometimes maybe a department or division that is a better fit for this position we hired you for? So you got to take care of that in the first 60 days. And even then, I think that's a little long, but certainly within 60 days. Okay, the last deadly sin, and then we're going to open it up for questions, is to treat every hire the same. Now, I'm not talking about equality. I'm not talking about being unfair. What I'm talking about is the leadership principle of differentiation. If you're going to be in the business of hiring rock stars, which I presume you are because you joined us today, you're going to have to treat those rock stars differently than your B and C players. Now, there is a question, why do you have B and C players? And that's another book, because you shouldn't be hiring B and C players. And if so, you should be exiting them. But you're going to have some. And that means your A players need different types of challenge, different types of coaching, and more compensation, disproportionately more compensation than your B and C players. Most managers do the following. They treat all their employees the same. And you know what I'm talking about. It's the end of the year. Our CFO says you can give out this much money in bonuses or salary increase, and managers tend to spread that evenly. They don't want confrontation. They don't want to make the tough decisions, or they just don't want to be unfair because they're too nice. It's more important to them to be liked. They succumb to their own desire to be liked than to what their responsibility is, which is to champion and retain their rock stars. Because if you lose them, you're screwed. Your company has no chance. Retaining your rock stars is about differentiation, showing them the love, showing them that you want and need and care about them, that you're willing to pay for them, giving them the disproportionate amount of compensation and not giving extra money to your B and C players. Again, there's a whole chapter in the book about how to do this, but please differentiate. And a couple of you people asked, will these slides be available? Yes, I'm going to send them to you if you want. So not a problem. You can study this. And the book has a lot of examples of this, because you're going to lose your rock stars unless you differentiate. And while that may not sound like a big deal, how do you build a company? How do you win? How do you beat your competitors and impress your investors if you're losing your rock stars? If you were lucky enough to hire them in the first place, then losing them is just stupidity. So you got to practice differentiation. And I know that's hard sometimes, because you're kind of saying to your B and C players, we're not giving you a raise. We're not promoting you. We're going to have some tough conversations and tough coaching. But that's what leadership is. That's what management is. And if you're not willing and able to do that, if your hiring managers aren't doing that, then you got bigger problems. Recruiting rock stars is not your biggest problem, because you've got cultural problems too. Okay, let's move. In the interest of time, we've got 7 minutes, and I want to open this up to questions. We went through the 10-step process. That is exactly what the book is. It's the 10-step playbook to picking the winners and igniting your business. And each chapter just kind of goes through one of them. Guys, I wish I could say this is rocket science. It is not. If you're interested in the book, you can go to recruitrockstars.com, and I'll take your questions in just a moment. Dick Costello, who's a friend who used to run Twitter, said he devoured this book in one weekend and he loved it. Dayton Ogden, who runs recruiting for a $6 billion Summit Partners, which is a big private equity firm, said this is the one book to read this year if you're going to grow your company. Brad Feld has been a friend for a long time, one of the top venture capitalists in the country. he's a fan of the book as well. If you don't want to buy the book, I don't care. That's totally fine. Here's a free way to get started. Subscribe to the Strong Suit podcast. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I interview a world-class expert on talent and recruiting. It's about 20 minutes. You can get that in the iTunes store, Strong Suit podcast. We had an amazing episode this morning, so just check that out. And email me if you want a copy of the deck, if you want anything. I read every single email, and I promise to respond, jeff@strongsuit.com. So with all that said, type your questions in the chat box. We only have about 5 minutes. I promised I wouldn't keep you late. So type in the chat box any questions on anything that we talked about today, and I'm happy to address them. And I'm going to give you 30 seconds to type your questions while I enjoy this last bit of bubbly. This has been a great party. I don't know about you guys, but I'm having a great time. Question, will there be a recording available? Absolutely. You will get an email after the webinar with the recording, so you can feel free to share it with your team. And I should mention that I do these webinars once a month. They're not always the crazy champagne party, but invite your colleagues to go to recruitrockstars.com. They can sign up for the next free webinar. And you know, I tell you that because you can't do this alone, right? If you are going to, even if you're going to be CEO, if you're head of HR, if you've got coworkers, you must all be on the same page when it comes to recruiting. So if you can't get people on your team to understand these things, I'm happy to help. I'm happy to talk to them and tell them to go to recruitrockstars.com/webinar. Next question, are there any legal issues involved with contacting backdoor references without consent? No, I have verified this with an attorney. I will preface that by saying in the United States, in the US, I can't talk to other countries on this topic, but I will say there's no legal issues. Obviously, you want to use common sense. So when doing backdoor references, I have no interest in outing or exposing that this person is considering a new position. I probably will not talk to anyone at their current employer. I kind of say that's off limits. Unless I know someone very intimately at that company, then I may check them out. But generally, aside from their current employer, I will absolutely talk to backdoor references that I find out. Now, I may not say I'm interviewing this person for a job. I may say I'm in discussions with Mary about doing some business together. And I just wanted to get your take on what she's like to work with, her attention to detail, whatever it might be. So there's different ways to go about it. Again, the book kind of lays them out. Not trying to get the person in trouble, but we're absolutely trying to validate with the best information we can. It may be with her vendors, her customers, her partners. It doesn't have to be her coworkers either. That's a great question. Any more questions before we wrap up? I know that I promised you we wouldn't be late, and I don't want to make people late for their next meeting. Okay, so just in summary to close out, I'm going to wrap up and tell you that you can totally do this. You can recruit Rockstars. I encourage you to get the book. If you don't want to get the book, that's fine. There's a free course, a free video course on my website, recruitrockstars.com. Send your coworkers there or have them sign up for this webinar, and I'll talk some sense into them. And please do stay in touch. And thanks for coming today.